This video compares the reliability of different shotguns in a concrete way. For many of these guns, I even have the amount of malfunctions that have happened within a given amount of rounds. Unless I say otherwise, assume I'm talking about just 12 gauge shotguns. Let's start off with Berettas. The first Beretta 1301 had no malfunctions during the 500 rounds fired. This was mostly birdshot, but there were some slugs and buckshot used as well. The second 1301 had roughly 1,100 rounds fired through it. At roughly 600 to 700 rounds, it started having problems chambering 3-inch buckshot. Interestingly, 2 3/4-inch shells, including birdshot, were still working well. This problem was solved by lubricating the bolt. The exact number of malfunctions was not mentioned, however. I should also mention that other Berettas, like the A400, can sometimes have problems with longer shells, and I'll explain this more later in the video. The first Beretta A300 went 500 assorted rounds with 0 malfunctions. The second A300 went 2,000 plus rounds with 0 malfunctions. The A400 went almost 2,000 rounds with only 1 malfunction. This is still very good reliability in my opinion when you compare it to other shotguns. Now for the first of the Mossbergs and the FNH SLP. The FNH was directly compared against the upper Mossberg 930 by the same tester. The FNH had 144 stoppages in 500 rounds, a stoppage rate of 28%. The upper Mossberg did much better as it had only 5 stoppages in 500 rounds, a stoppage rate of only 1%. I should also mention that they don't make the FNH SLP anymore. The lower Mossberg had 400 plus rounds fired through it with no malfunctions. Obviously the question will be asked, why did one Mossberg SPX have malfunctions and the other one didn't? I'll mention one more Mossberg 930 review and it'll help answer this question. For this Mossberg, it had roughly 10 malfunctions in 250 rounds. The reviewer mentioned that slugs and buckshot were 100% reliable, but it was hit or miss with the comparatively lighter target loads. It's also important to mention the fact that birdshot failed to cycle when the shotgun was limp-wristed or held loosely. The review also mentions that after the break-in period, Mossberg 930s are very reliable even with birdshot. Now to answer the question about why 930s may have differing amounts of reliability out of the box, mechanical devices like firearms and motor vehicles require a period of wear, commonly known as a break-in period, before they can optimally function. Depending on how the parts wear in one shotgun, it can finish this break-in period and become reliable sooner than a different shotgun of the same model. For the first Mossberg 930, we have 500 assorted rounds fired with no malfunctions. This included 3-inch shells and old paper hull shells. For the second 940, we have over 500 assorted rounds fired with no malfunctions. Also, it seems that Mossberg no longer lists many of the 930s that they used to sell on their website. Only the rifle barrel version and the 2 SPX versions are left. I can only assume they intend to eventually replace the 930 altogether. I find this somewhat disappointing because the 930 was noticeably cheaper than the 940 models that are replacing it. For example, the 940 Tactical is being sold for about twice the price the old 930 home security version sells for. In my opinion, this will lead consumers to go to other companies like Stoeger to buy budget-friendly semi-autos. Next we have the Weatherby Element Deluxe. It's obviously just a more refined version of the basic Element shotgun. It had only 1 malfunction during the 1,200 target rounds fired, which is pretty good. It went almost 2,500 rounds without cleaning before it started to malfunction. The Stoeger M3K is a competition version of the standard M3000. It had 7 malfunctions in the first 250 rounds. Most or all of these were caused by using the lighter Herters or Jerry Miculek branded rounds. Considering you're supposed to break in the shotgun before it will cycle light loads reliably, this is not surprising. Finally, we have the Benelli M4, known around the world for its large price tag and its combat use. 500 assorted rounds were fired. Most or all of the resulting 6 malfunctions were with birdshot. However, the tester was using a 5-round spring in a 7-round tube. This could possibly have contributed to the malfunctions. Seeing other reviews of the M4 led me to believe that this is not a magazine spring problem, but rather something else. If the spring was really the problem, you'd expect malfunctions would happen more often, and they would happen with both birdshot and buckshot. This is why I want to mention a few more things about the M4's reliability. Some people have zero problems with lighter birdshot loads, but others do have problems. In the top video, we have various birdshot rounds being tested in a Benelli M4. He had one malfunction out of a bunch of different rounds. And I'm just going to say that he used roughly 50 or 60 rounds because I'm not going to go to the trouble to count all the rounds he fired. Next, we have a quote from Gun University's M4 review. Since they found it was a bit finicky, they gave it a B ranking for reliability. Finally, we have a video where an M4 was frequently malfunctioning with birdshot. Since it only had about 15 rounds through it, you could easily make the case that this was due to the fact that it had not gone through its break-in period. As for the other two examples above, it's certainly possible that every now and then you'll have a malfunction with the lighter birdshot round. In conclusion, some of these problems may be attributed to a break-in period. However, the M4 at the top was already broken in, so some M4s with certain light loads will occasionally malfunction. Folks like to attribute legendary properties to the M4, so I'm sure this fact will cause some disagreement. The Mossberg Maverick 88 had no malfunctions during the 505 rounds fired through it. I mention this because some people don't have a lot of money, and a reliable $200 shotgun can be very tempting. The AK-SA is a Benelli M4 clone, and while I don't have a lot of confidence in such clones, this specific gun did pretty well. At the beginning of the test, there were a few malfunctions, but after that there was only one in the over 500 rounds that were fired. Other than that, all you need to know is that it doesn't cycle Fiocchi low recoil buckshot well. This is a reliability chart that I have made with reviews from Outdoor Life. It is mostly semi-autos, but there are some over-unders and pump actions mixed in. I find it very interesting that the pumps and the double barrels are not undoubtedly the most reliable shotguns on this chart. A good takeaway may be that the design, quality, and model of the shotgun are more important in determining its reliability than its action. I'm sure you've noticed the fact that the Remington V3 is the most reliable shotgun on this chart. As much as I like the design of the V3, I would be hesitant to recommend buying one today. After Remington's decline in quality, bankruptcy, and transition to Rem arms, I'm not entirely certain that each of the V3s made today will be perfect. I'd be more likely to recommend one of their shotguns if they came with a warranty. However, they currently don't have a written warranty of any kind. Other than that, I don't have much to say about this chart because the finer details of reliability and testing were left out of these reviews. Obviously, you should make sure to clean and lubricate your shotgun as needed, but I also think it's very important to know how many rounds a shotgun can go before it really needs to be cleaned. First of all, the Mossberg 930 needs to be cleaned every 400 to 600 rounds, depending on the ammo you use. The 940 can go longer, and Mossberg's website boasts that it can go up to 1500 rounds between cleanings. The Benelli M2 went 1000 plus rounds without needing a cleaning. Surprisingly, the bolt wasn't that dirty. The Remington V3 went 2,500 rounds with lubricant, and went almost 1,500 rounds without lubricant. When the V3 wasn't being lubricated, it had less than 10 malfunctions in the 2,500 rounds it fired. The Benelli Ethos, which is an inertia shotgun by the way, went 1,800 rounds before it started having problems and needed to be cleaned. We also have the Weatherby Element that went 2,500 rounds before it started having problems and needed to be cleaned. Also, CZ claims that their 1012 shotgun can go 5,000 rounds without malfunctions, without having any cleaning or lubrication. I found it interesting that the gas-operated V3 and the inertia-driven Weatherby Element had pretty similar results. The V3 has an entirely different design than conventional gas-operated shotguns, and this obviously helped it. Remember how I said that I liked the V3 design? This is one of the reasons why. Conventional gas-operated shotguns tend to be dirtier and very dependent on the gas ports, plus the gas seals being clean, which is why they generally require more cleaning and attention than inertia shotguns that have none of these problems. Next, we have some statements about the reliability of Beretta shotguns. First, we have a forum post where someone says that the A400s he owns can go 10,000 rounds without cleaning if he uses the right ammo. Next is another forum post where the Beretta 391 owner says that he has run 5,000 rounds through his gun without any serious cleaning. One more forum post says that after about 7,000 to 8,000 rounds, a Beretta 391 has serious carbon buildup. These numbers are pretty high, but it's hard to outright dismiss what others say. We also have the Remington 1100. A 20-gauge version of the 1100 went 24,000 rounds without cleaning, malfunction, or breakage. Does this mean that the 1100 is the most reliable shotgun there is, and it can only be rivaled by a Beretta A400? Not really. There are clearly better gas systems than the one the 1100 has, and high round count tests like these would give different results if they were done today. That 1100 test was a testament to the quality of the parts that Remington was making back then. If today's Rem Arms had similar confidence in the quality of their parts, they would have no problems repeating this test and enjoying the benefits of the increased publicity. This part about the Benelli M4 isn't actually about how long it can go without cleaning, but rather its durability. Some people like to focus on the fact that it went 25,000 rounds without any major parts breakage, while I would say any premium shotgun should be able to do that. The advantage the Benelli has is that it's arguably more durable and reliable than any other shotgun. The quote on the top is about how few M4s broke compared to other shotguns used by the Marines. The quote on the bottom details how the M4 had flawless functioning during the 25,000 rounds they fired. This obviously excludes things like the non-lethal beanbag rounds. This chart shows the reliability of different shotguns on a 5-star scale. They're listed in no particular order. Some of these ratings require a little clarification. The Stoeger M3000R is the version with the rifled barrel. It was rated lower because, out of the box, the factory grease was causing malfunctions. These malfunctions stopped once it was cleaned and properly lubed. Similarly, when properly cleaned, the regular Stoeger M3000 reliably cycled all but the lightest loads. The Mossberg 930 Tactical worked perfect with buckshot and full power loads, but it was hit and miss with the lighter practice loads. The Gen 1 Beretta 1301 got a lower rating because hitting the bolt release in a specific way caused the gun to double feed. Beretta sells a $10 bolt shroud kit to fix any Gen 1 versions lying around, and the Gen 2 versions are upgraded so they don't have this problem. The Beretta A400 got a lower rating because it had one malfunction in the 2,000 rounds it fired. Other than that, these results pretty much speak for themselves. If you're not finished reading this chart, pause the video now, because I'm going to move on. For the next part, I'm going to be mostly talking about the Stoeger M3000. There seems to be some disagreement about whether or not it runs lighter loads. However, there is no disagreement that the M3000 works well with the 1 1/8 3-dram equivalent loads Stoeger recommends you use. What I find particularly strange is that the top reviewer discovered that his M3000 does not work reliably with birdshot when he holds it tightly against his shoulder. All the other reviewers I've seen mention completely the opposite advice, that it's important to hold the M3000 tightly or it won't cycle right. It's quite counterintuitive that both of these things can be true. The way the inertia-driven M3000 works is that when you fire the gun, the bolt briefly stays still while the rest of the gun moves backwards. Inertia guns are much more dependent on you giving them a certain amount of resistance than gas guns, which is why this happens. If you have a light load and you are firing from an unconventional position, it will not have enough resistance to reliably cycle. Likewise, if the M3000 is not allowed to move backwards at all upon firing, this prevents it from cycling as intended. This may start to explain why the one reviewer's M3000 was acting in the way that it did. The M3000's inertia system is not a bad one. You just need to understand that it requires a certain amount of resistance and 3-dram equivalent shells to prevent any of these malfunctions. I also want to mention that I like the M3000's design over others like the Mossberg 940 because it allows a shorter length of pull. This is because the action spring is located under the handguard instead of inside the stock, like it is with other guns such as the Benelli M2 or the Mossberg 930. I mentioned before that there was some disagreement about what loads the M3000 will cycle. For example, people have commented on different YouTube videos saying that they have an M3000 and it doesn't cycle light loads, while other folks have no such problems with light loads. One of the reasons that this could be happening is because there is a difference in strength of the action spring between guns. Naturally, the more rounds you fire through your gun, the weaker the action spring gets. MOA Precision sells an action spring created specifically to use lighter loads. It is roughly 25% weaker than the stock springs, which gives it the ability to reliably cycle the lighter 1 1/8 ounce shot shells that have an 1145 feet per second velocity. The downside, of course, is increased recoil and increased wear with 3-inch shells. I should also say that the M3000 isn't the only shotgun people disagree about whether or not it's reliable with light loads. Part of the problem is quality control of both the gun and the ammunition used. Part of the problem is that folks are failing to mention the specifics of the light load they're using. Say I have the same model of shotgun you do, and we're both using what we consider to be light loads. My light loads are slower than yours, and it's just enough of a difference to start to cause malfunctions, while your light loads are still working fine. Obviously, we can come to totally different conclusions about whether or not the same gun can use what we both call light loads. Now for a bit of comparison between the M3000 and other guns. The first reviewer determined that the Benelli M2 Super 90 was less reliable than the M3000 because the M3000 would cycle low brass and the M2 wouldn't. The second reviewer had a small sample size of a few rounds, but he determined that the Benelli Super Black Eagle 2 was less reliable than the M3000, with the same 7/8 ounce 1200 feet per second rounds. However, judging from how weakly the shells were ejecting, the M3000 was on the very edge of malfunctioning. The third reviewer found that he could use loads as low as 3/4 ounce with his M3000. I assume he had either changed his action spring or had significantly weakened it with his use for this to happen, because this is far from Stoeger's minimum load requirement. In comparison, he found that the Beretta he used liked specific high-quality 1 1/8 ounce loads. It also needed to be clean, but not 100% clean, or it wouldn't be reliable. I find it quite strange that his Beretta didn't work when it was perfectly clean. Beretta says specifically not to get any oil or solvents inside the gas cylinder because this will cause it to malfunction. The reviewer said that he would fire a few rounds through the Beretta after cleaning it so it would be reliable again. I wonder if he was inadvertently getting oil inside the gas cylinder, and by firing a few rounds through it, this was enough to clear out the oil and make it reliable again. Now for the Benelli M2. This reviewer found that his M2 works reliably with 1 1/8 ounce target loads at 1200 feet per second, though they weren't 100% reliable when the gun was upside down and fired over his head. Another caveat being, if you're firing very quickly, you can outrun the bolt and cause a malfunction. I would expect that an M2 that is both broken in and properly lubricated to cycle 1 1/8 ounce loads at 1200 feet per second. This is because of the reviews that I have seen in Benelli's website. Their website states for a 12-gauge M2, the minimum load required to cycle it is a 3-dram equivalent with 1 1/8 ounce shot. This translates to roughly 1200 feet per second of velocity. By the way, the M2 owner's manual says that a 12-gauge shotgun requires 230 kgm, roughly 1700 foot-pounds of energy, to cycle the action. If you have an M2 that doesn't cycle this load after breaking in, it's not a big deal because you can buy a lighter recoil spring from Terran Tactical or Wolf, and this will likely solve the problem. Obviously, a lighter spring will give you heavier recoil and potentially less reliability if the gun is very dirty and or unlubricated. For those of you who don't know, the recoil spring is the action spring in the stock, not the inertia spring. Using non-Benelli parts does void the warranty, by the way. Inertia-driven Benellis also sometimes have a problem, where if you softly release the bolt won't actually close all the way, and you'll get a click when you pull the trigger. Retay shotguns based off the Benelli design don't have this problem. Inertia shotguns are also sensitive to the amount of weight that you put on them, so it may not be reliable if you weigh it down with flashlights and spare rounds. Now I'm going to talk about Beretta shotguns. These first two bullet points talk about how some of the original A400s used to have problems with the larger 3 and 3.5 inch shells. I couldn't find a detailed explanation of why this was, by the way. Apparently the Extreme Plus is not supposed to have these cycling problems. The last bullet point talks about how an inertia Benelli is more reliable than the Beretta 391 when soaking wet. Other than that, the 391 is more reliable because it handles the lighter 1 ounce loads much better than the Benelli, which comparatively has hit or miss performance with these. This shouldn't be surprising because 12 gauge Benelli inertia shotguns have a recommended minimum load of a 3 dram equivalent with 1 1/8 ounce shot. As a quick side note, I wanted to show you a quote from someone who owns both Benellis and Berettas. He says that his Benelli M2 is his go-to gun for wet and muddy conditions. He didn't really elaborate why the Benelli was best though. If I were to make a guess as to why this was, it'd be that the gas-operated shotguns have the potential for water to enter the gas system and cause problems. Since the previously mentioned Benellis don't have gas systems, this isn't a problem for them. People also like to compare the Beretta 1301 and the A300. It's important to mention that the A300 Patrol is significantly different than the other A300s because it has a larger magazine and it has the 1301's gas system. There are about 2 or 3 significant differences between these guns. First of all, the 1301 has somewhat less recoil and cycles faster. Second of all, the A300 has a larger loading port, which makes loading much easier. Finally, the 1301 has the action spring under the handguard instead of in the stock like the A300 does. I'd say that the less important differences are that the 1301 is potentially slightly more reliable with very light loads. Also, the 1301 barrel is more durable and it has a better forcing cone. The 1301 also has a great deal more chrome-lined parts. You can also get a 1301 from the factory with a pistol grip stock, but not an A300. I would say that these things are nice to have, but they don't give a massive advantage. In fact, I would say that the enlarged loading port of the A300 is one of the most important features to have on a tactical shotgun. What would be a massive advantage would be a red dot, which is why if you want a Beretta, I'd suggest buying an A300 and a red dot, rather than spending roughly the same amount of money on a 1301. This is how reliable shotguns were when they were shot upside down and held above the shooter's head. This so-called over-the-head test demonstrates reliability in unconventional shooting positions. All of the shotguns were tested with Federal 1 1/8 ounce Federal Top Gun rounds. One would suspect that inertia shotguns would be consistently bad at this sort of test for obvious reasons. In reality, it seems that whether the shotgun is gas-operated or inertia-driven is not a good predictor about how well it does in this test. I also want to mention 2 things about the Stoeger M3500 that was tested. First of all, this shotgun did not go through the required break-in period before this test happened. Since the break-in period did not happen, the M3500 malfunctioned in normal use before this test. Second of all, as far as I know, the M3500 and the M3000 both use the same inertia spring. So the fact that the M3500 is designed to use 3.5 inch shells does not have any impact on this test. It's possible that the Beretta A300 wasn't sufficiently broken in either, but since this wasn't mentioned in the video, I can't say for certain. In comparison, the Beretta A400 did function reliably. To be fair though, it had roughly 100 rounds through it, so it may have been mostly broken in. However, during the other testing that was done in that video, the A400 Extreme Plus failed to feed one of the 3.5-inch shells that was used. This seems to disprove the claims made before that these problems with the longer shells in A400s have been completely solved. Next, if you have a Mossberg 930 that seems to malfunction in high humidity, this is probably due to condensation forming between the piston spacer tube and the mag tube. The Mossberg 940 doesn't have this problem because it has a vented piston spacer tube. Mossberg doesn't make an improved spacer tube for the 930, but you still have a couple options. You could buy a spacer tube from OR3 Gun, or if the warranty on your 930 has expired, you could take the existing spacer tube to a gunsmith and have him drill some holes in it for you. Mossberg 930s, like many semi-auto shotguns, can jam if you hit the bolt release while the bolt is closed. This happens because the bolt release also acts as the shell release for unloading. To fix this jam, you need to stick your finger into the open bolt and push one of the two shells that have tried to load back into the magazine. This two-shell jam can be a real nuisance if you're hunting, or a fatal mistake if you're defending yourself. Seeing how this is not just a 930 specific problem, it may be wise to assume that this can happen to any semi-auto that you come across, and that you may be able to avoid this problem altogether by training yourself to release shotgun bolts by pulling back and releasing the charging handle instead of using the bolt release. This has worked fine for me, but your experiences may be different than mine. One last thing, as far as I know, Benelli M4s, Benelli M1s, Savage Renegades, and the Beretta A400 don't have this two-shell jamming problem. Next, I want to talk about the Weatherby Element and the Weatherby SA-08. First of all, the Element is undeniably more popular. The website TrueGunValue.com tracks the amount of guns that are sold, and it shows that 1,139 Elements were sold compared to only 159 SA-08s. In fact, Weatherby only sells one version of the SA-08 anymore, a compact version that has a 12.5-inch length of pull. As far as the SA-08 goes, it will cycle light loads after roughly 100 rounds. Considering Weatherby says to expect a break-in period of at least 100 rounds, this is right on the money. Some have even had success getting it to run 1 ounce, 1,200 feet per second Challenger target loads. This chart shows the minimum loads needed to reliably cycle different shotguns. This information is from either the owner's manual or the company's website. For the SA-08 and the Element, they say that you should expect the guns to reliably cycle with a minimum of 1 1/8 ounce load at 1,300 feet per second. In comparison, Benelli and Stoeger inertia shotguns have a minimum load requirement that would be 1 1/8 ounce at 1,200 feet per second. There's an even greater difference when you look at the Weatherby SA-459. It needs a minimum of 1 1/4 ounce at 1,330 feet per second. I once considered getting an SA-459, and let me tell you, knowing what I do now, I'm very glad I didn't, because I would have been very unhappy to find out for myself the amount of rounds that it was never intended to reliably use. The guns that are intended to cycle light loads the best seem to be the Berettas, and the Winchester SX4 comes in second. However, there are a lot of guns that aren't on this chart that can cycle light loads as well. One last thing, I find it interesting that the Benellis and the Stoegers with 3.5-inch chambers are intended to cycle lighter loads than the gas-operated 3.5-inch chambered guns. This segment is based off the experience of 4 men who hunt waterfowl together. They each had a different shotgun and they wanted to directly compare how well each shotgun did. In conclusion, the Retay Masa Mara, Stoeger M3000, and the Beretta A400 Explorer all did great. The only shotgun that didn't do well was the Beretta A400 Extreme Unico. It did not work well with light loads or 3.5-inch shells. As I've already mentioned, some of the A400s tested have had this problem, and this sort of performance is really just unacceptable for such an expensive shotgun. By the way, the Retay Gordion is an inertia-driven shotgun that can potentially cycle light loads after you break it in. Sadly, their design inherently limits your magazine capacity. Interestingly, they have metal trigger guards, while more expensive shotguns like the Beretta 1301 and Winchester SX4 have polymer trigger guards. I'll be talking about Turkish-made Benelli M4 clones next. I personally would not buy an M4 clone of any type. However, I understand other people will want to, which is why I will mention that the most significant problem that they can have is improper heat treating. Before you buy one, take the time to check the pistons and the bolt where they meet. If there is wear or peening of metal, this is your sign not to buy the gun. Improper heat treating typically leads to the bolt being immovably seized in the receiver. A Black Aces S4 did exactly this after 500 rounds. If you buy a clone, it may be durable and work flawlessly, but you need to have a backup plan if this isn't the case. Customer service can be majorly lacking from these companies that sell M4 clones, which wouldn't be so bad if I could bypass customer service and easily order spare parts from their website. Some websites don't sell parts at all, and Charles Daly, for example, is supposed to sell parts, but they had none in stock when I made this video. It could be possible to use Benelli parts if you need something small like a spring or an extractor. However, if you discover something major is wrong, like an improperly heat-treated bolt or 2 broken pistons, you are talking about at least $200 to fix it. I think the Panzer M4 belongs in its own category. It has plenty of good reviews, and as far as M4 clones go, it's probably the best. They still have quality control issues, but not nearly as bad as the competing M4 clones do. You may be asking, is it comparable in quality to a Mossberg 930 or other competitor at the same price? Probably not. This particular review seems to have had the stock retaining spring come off at roughly 500 rounds, which is bad but not the worst thing that could happen. What made this much worse was the fact that the customer service would not answer the reviewer's calls. Is this an outlier case? It might be, considering how many other people have had no problems like this. Obviously, reliability is very important, but it's not the only thing that matters. The warranty on the shotgun gives you an idea of how much faith the manufacturer is willing to put into their product. Other than that, having a shotgun with the right length of pull is very important. This is because it affects your ability to control recoil and shoot quickly. This is why I'm such a fan of shotguns that allow you to change the length of pull, particularly if they don't have the action spring in the stock. Knowing what I do now, if I needed to buy a budget semi-auto tactical shotgun, I would get a Stoeger M3000 model number 31891FS. It comes with 7+1 capacity, an enlarged loading port, ghost ring sights, and a pistol grip stock. A Mossberg 930 home security is roughly the same price and is softer shooting, but only has a bead sight. However, I doubt the 930s will be around much longer after the introduction of the 940. I'm also used to crossbolt safeties, and I prefer pistol grip stocks. I will say that I think a length of pull of almost 14.5 inches is a bit much, so I'd wait until the warranty has expired and then shorten the stock a bit. I don't want to give a general recommendation for hunting shotguns because I'd have to know what features are important to you as well as what kind of price range you have. If you want to tell me what you're looking for in a shotgun, I'd be more than happy to give a suggestion or two in the comments section. Thanks for watching!